A very good evening once again to everybody who's joined us today from wherever you are, from India, Sri Lanka, whichever part of the globe you are. We hope you're all keeping safe. And we are very happy once again, a part of our learning with Cambridge during the lockdown, another webinar on teacher observation. I'm not sure in case if any of you have not early attended our earlier webinars. To introduce you today, the presenter is Dr. Shayanti Talwar. Shayanti is one of our most senior and experienced presenters for Cambridge Assessment English. She does a lot of material workshops for us, a lot of teacher support programs for us, as well as a lot of webinars. So we're very happy once again to have Shayanti with us. Just a few housekeeping announcements before I hand over to Shayanti. In case if you do get logged out, please log in again. We will be sending you a participation certificate for all of you who remain to the end of the webinar. So you'll get it in your email in a couple of days. Shayanti as well as myself, we are doing this webinar from home. So in case if you hear the doorbell ring or we do get disconnected, we'll connect back again. But we hope you enjoy this the whole plan is to do this webinar for about 45 minutes to 50 minutes, and then we'll try some time for questions. Yeah, so please do reserve your questions at the end. And over to Shayanti.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you so much again for that very kind and generous introduction. And very good evening to participants from across India, South Asia, who have turned up yet again in such great numbers. It's really heartening to see the response. And yet again, I hope that we will have what I foresee as a constructive, engaging session. And an interactive session, because we are going to have question answers after the presentation. So today's webinar is on teacher observation, and the name of the webinar is Humanizing Your Resource. So I will start with the webinar, and just before I go into the actual presentation topic, I would like you to very briefly take you through Cambridge English and its reach and spread. So, right. So I'm assuming that many of you have attended Cambridge Assessment webinars earlier, but just to take you quickly through Cambridge Assessment English, we are into exams, English proficiency exams, and Cambridge has a formidable presence globally. And these are some numbers, some figures for you, just to give you an idea of the reach and spread of Cambridge English. So you can see that there are over 60 million exams and tests that have been taken till date. And Cambridge English is operative in 130 countries of the world with more than around 2,800 exam centers. It supports over 20 million digital learners, and Cambridge exams are recognized officially and globally by 20,000 organizations across the world. Cambridge English exams are taken by over 50,000 schools, and on an average, around 5.5 million qualifications and tests are taken every year. So that's the reach and spread of Cambridge English exams. Right. So to give you an overview of today's webinar, we can say that today's webinar is divided into two parts. The first part will focus on understanding the teacher, and the second part will try and understand what teacher observation is all about. So why teacher observation is relevant today? What is teacher observation actually? Is it what we normally understand as teacher observation, or is there more to it? And how do we go about teacher observation? And finally, it'll wrap up by looking at the takeaways. So that's the structure of today's presentation. So first, in understanding the teacher, let's first understand who is a teacher. what has a teacher traditionally meant? So, the teacher traditionally has always been a highly venerated, a highly respected person, someone who is held in very high esteem. Whether we speak about the Guru Shishya Parampara in India, you can see this is a clipping from, this is a scene from the Mahabharata. You might be familiar with the scene. You have Arjun, who is asked to focus, who is asked to aim and shoot a bird by his Guru Dronacharya. And here we have an example of the Guru Shishya Parampara and a Guru who enables reflection and learner autonomy in his disciples. So, whether we talk about the Indian tradition or we talk about the ancients of Greece, whether it's Plato, Socrates, or Aristotle, or we talk about figures like Savitribai Phule, who changed the complete paradigm of teaching, who revolutionized the teaching scene. Well, teaching and teachers were always held in the highest possible esteem, and they were universally respected, and the vocation of teaching was considered to be one of the noblest ones. Teachers were, in fact, kingmakers. They were a beacon of hope. They were someone who were much more than parents, right? They were people who changed the paradigm. In fact, teachers were the biggest and the most influential presence in the life of an individual. So that's what the teacher traditionally stands for. Now, let's understand what the teacher or who the teacher is today. The teacher today is a small part of a large organization. She's hired by human resource. We treat the teacher today as a resource, part of a resource pool, not really as an individual, but as an impersonal entity who is part of a bigger whole, who fits a certain criteria, like the person with the right kind of qualifications, a subject expert, someone who knows her job, who can manage a classroom, conduct exams, design activities, counsel students, talk to parents, etc., etc. So we try to fit every teacher hired by human resource into a pre-designed template. But how much do we get to know about the individual behind the standardized template? How far do we get in knowing the individual, the teacher? And that is why we need to do this webinar and reflect on the practice of teacher observation, because teacher observation implies an engagement with the teacher. It implies an effort to humanize the teacher. Despite all the technology and the access to information that we have today, well, let us face it is still the teacher, the human presence, who is the most indispensable part in the classroom and who is the most indispensable resource in the classroom. So, there are two major reasons behind teacher observation. One is to initiate an engagement, and the other is to humanize the teacher, to humanize the so called resource. So, what is teacher observation? Well, usually teacher observation is interchangeably used with the word monitoring. So often we speak of teacher monitoring, monitoring the teacher rather than observing the teacher. Now, what does monitoring imply? Monitoring implies notions of evaluation, assessment, vetting. Again, making sure whether the teacher is a neat fit into the organizational template. But teacher observation actually entails a lot more. And it ought to suggest a lot more too. It ought to first of all imply getting to know your resource better, getting to know the teacher as a human being. So the first step in teacher observation is getting to know the teacher, ice breaking, breaking the ice with the teacher. We normally break the ice with students. We never think about breaking the ice with the teacher. It is important that we understand and we acknowledge our teachers as human beings. So, after getting to know the teacher, we come to acknowledging the teacher. And what does acknowledging the teacher mean? Well, to acknowledge them as human beings is to accept that just like a teacher has her strengths, she will also have her shortcomings. Because all humans are flawed and being imperfect is beautiful. It also means that there's room for more, there's room for growth, for development, there's scope to evolve, there's the possibility of growing, of maturing, of blossoming. And that can be possible only when, along with the observer, the teacher too looks at observation and understands it. So she has to look at the whole process of observation and understand it for what it is. She need not be intimidated by it or be wary or leery of it, but understand it as a necessary and indispensable part of her growth and her opportunity to learn from each other. So, basically, a 360-degree kind of view and understanding of what is teacher observation is what I intend to start with. And then we go to look at ways of seeing. So, what are the observation patterns that we can follow, which will be constructive, which will be beneficial for the organization and the teacher both? So, if you look at the visual, I've used this visual as a metaphor, as an analogy to drive home my point. Now, if you see the visual, it has two parts. For the man who is on the island, this man is so excited to see a boat, probably because he is marooned on the island and he needs to get away from the island. But for the man on the boat, he is equally excited to see the island. Now, what does that mean? Well, maybe he has been on the boat for a very long time, and the very prospect of hitting the shore leaves him full of excitement. So, these are ways of seeing. Both are right from their respective positions, right? And observation similarly entails that it depends on who is observing. The takeaways will always depend on the observer, and who is observing will determine the teacher's progress and her growth. So let's look at the possible observation patterns over here. Well, the most common practice is where the supervisor or the head of the department or the principal or the vice principal observes the teacher. So, a common practice is where the head or the supervisor peeps in, observes for some time, and moves on just to ensure all's well with the world. But honestly, we can do more, right? Teacher to teacher. Now, we can encourage teachers teaching the same subject or the same stream to observe each other. Now, why is this such a great idea? Because then teacher A can observe teacher B handling the same topic and can look at her strengths, look at the way she addresses problems, look at the way she clears doubts, look at the way she approaches a topic, and also perhaps after the observation, the two teachers can get together and sound off their doubts, their difficulties, their apprehensions, and also share their joys, right? So that's the benefit of having the teacher of the same subject observing a fellow teacher. Now, teacher to teacher, a different subject. Now, why is this important? Say, why should a physics teacher occasionally observe a language teacher? Or maybe a social studies teacher observe a mathematics teacher? Because eventually, we are all moving towards an interdisciplinary approach. There are no watertight compartments anymore, no rigid categories. You have historians today using metallurgical and scientific evidence to talk about mass migrations. You have economists working with scientists and mathematicians to come up with growth and sustenance models. You have humanities scholars working with environmentalists. And of course, you have IT or artificial intelligence taking everything in its way. So it is an extremely good practice to have an interdisciplinary environment in your organization where teachers come to know what their colleagues in other fields are doing. They come to know what a subject is all about. They are familiarized with another discipline. And for all you know, they might borrow from that discipline. Maybe an approach, maybe a point, maybe some significant takeaway for them, which they can then embed or incorporate in their own classroom, right? Moving on, we can have a junior teacher observing a senior colleague. Now, this could be seen as an opportunity for the junior colleague to learn from the senior colleague. And at the same time, the junior colleague can also offer feedback to the senior colleague, thus turning the workplace into a truly democratic space. So, what is truly democratic? Where juniors can offer feedback without any inhibitions to their seniors. Also, maybe a junior colleague could be more tech savvy, they could be more innovative, they could bring more energy into the classroom, and they could probably be more forthcoming and proactive in offering assistance, right? Similarly, if there's a senior colleague who is made to observe a junior colleague, the junior colleague could benefit from the senior colleague's experience, the number of years they have put into the organization, the extent of their familiarity with the subject, their authority of the subject, and so on. So that is how an with environment of mutual respect can be encouraged. We can have a special observer also. Who is a special observer? A special observer would be a specially qualified and a dedicated teacher educator who can be hired and given the task of observing teachers. Their skill sets, their experience, and their expertise will surely add value to the development of teachers. Moving on, the last one, and I think it's a very, very significant and very effective observation pattern, which is self observation. Now, this is where the teacher observes herself. How do we make this happen? We do a video shooting of the teacher's sessions once in a while and delayed viewing by the teacher, followed by self reflection. Now, why is this so effective? Because I might be I might have an impression that I'm a fabulous teacher. I have a great rapport going with the students. I have a tremendously effective classroom presence. I know my subject very well. I bring good energy in the classroom. I am wonderful with my teaching learning resources. But there could be areas like maybe my whiteboard management is not that good, or maybe I'm not that tech savvy, or perhaps I tend to favor one set of learners to the other. It could be anything. Now, a video shooting will put it on record and I can go through it later, where I don't have to necessarily experience the maybe sometimes some teachers might find it embarrassing to be observed by others. So there is no embarrassment because I am looking at my own performance in the classroom, right? And that is when I come to know, oh, is this the way I talk in the classroom? Well, I need to change this. Or wasn't that too fast for the learners? Oh, well, here I skipped a question. I don't think I paid too much attention to what that learner was saying. Oh my God, look at my handwriting on the whiteboard. So there could be so many features, so many elements that could come up in a video recording, right? And that is why I personally feel that self observation and self reflection are extremely effective. So these were some of the observation patterns, ways of seeing the teacher, right? Now, of course, the next important thing is observation parameters. We have to decide when we observe the teacher or when we are looking at our performance in the classroom, what are the things that we are going to observe, right? So we have to set parameters. And these are some of the parameters. You can have your own. Every organization evolves their own observation parameters. I'm here to share a few with you. So I think the first and the most important parameter is that to what extent is the teacher a human being in the classroom? Besides her IQ, the teacher needs to have a very strong EQ too, which enables her to connect with her learners, right? So, under this parameter, you can have areas like the teacher's classroom presence, the kind of rapport she builds with her students, her interaction with her students. Is it just one sided where the teacher is talking to the students, or does she allow the students to talk to her? Is it only the teacher who gives feedback, who offers consolidation, who is eager to explain concepts? Or is it also the students? Does she nominate students in giving feedback, in complimenting, or in asking questions, or in wanting their doubts clarified, right? So, to what extent does the teacher treat her students as human beings, not as one homogeneous whole, but as individuals who with different learning and acquisition levels? So, which will determine her interaction patterns. Then the teacher's fairness, is she impartial or does she favor one section of the classroom? What is her body language like? Right? Is she facing one, is she veering towards one half of the classroom too much? Is she centrally positioned in the classroom? Does she make eye contact with everyone? Does she maintain a neutral body face? So these are some of the things that make the teacher, that go into making the teacher a human being, right? Her impartial approach, her willingness to be receptive. Is the teacher in a hurry? Or does she show patience? Does she stop to address queries? Does she stop to consolidate? So, all of these will come in your first parameter of the teacher as a human being. The next one is, yeah, also in the teacher as a human being, I think important is whether the teacher is able to personalize her teaching, right? Perhaps incorporate stories from her life, or stories or situations which students find relatable, which students could identify with, the amount of humor which a teacher uses. So all of these go into the first parameter. Moving on to classroom management, how well is the teacher able to handle mixed ability learners? Now, we all know that learners come from different backgrounds, they have different motivation levels, they have different proficiency levels, they have a different, they acquire things at different pace. They are not on the same level, right? They also differ as per their habits, their personality traits. Some learners can be very outgoing, they are very enthusiastic, they are engaged, they are involved, they are self motivated. There could be other learners who are shy and reticent, who would rather have a laid back approach to the whole scene of the classroom. So how do we balance these learners? Do we put, and then there could be learners who have had a change of environment, who are not really very comfortable with the new classroom scene. There could be learners who are bullies, could be learners who get bullied. So how are we going to pair? How are we going to group the learners? How do we handle them so that one learner does not get dominated by the other, everyone gets a fair opportunity? So all of this comes under classroom management. Also, if there's an activity, how does the teacher stage her activity? How does she use the space? Does the classroom turn into a chaotic space, or is it a very smooth kind of staging of activities? How does the teacher nominate? Is she too eager and in a hurry to nominate only the smarter learners, or does she give the weak learners also an opportunity? The teacher's grouping techniques, her spatial management. In fact, even the way she goes around, she explores or she toys with the possibilities of furniture that is not mobile, immovable furniture. Then how does she manage teaching through the available resources? How does she optimally use teaching learning material? All of this comes under classroom management. So this could be a parameter in your observation template. The next parameter is flexibility and fluidity. Now, what does this mean? Well, this is the ability of the teacher to switch roles, to transition maybe from an instructor to a motivator, to a friend, to a counsel, to a monitor, to a language resource, to a subject expert. There could be varying roles which the teacher needs to perform within the span of a single session, right? So she is someone who needs to be able to switch roles, someone who guides, navigates, sometimes lets students take charge, monitors without interfering, without breathing down their necks, and someone who is an enabler. Now, the next point is very important, not only for language teachers, but also for teachers teaching other subjects. The teacher as a language resource and a knowledge resource. Now, obviously, as a knowledge resource, it goes without saying that the teacher needs to have a good command, a good authority over her subject area, right? But besides that, regardless of whatever she is teaching, whichever subject she's handling, the teacher has to also be particular about the language which she is using, right? Because she is, after all, using a language to interact. Now, let's presume this is English. So the teacher needs to pay attention to her classroom English or her classroom language. Now, why is this so important? Because as teachers, we are role models for our students. Our students emulate us, right? So, whatever language we use, whatever language we use, whatever language we use,
It looks like Shayanti may be facing some technical challenges. We'll just give it a minute for her to restart.
am I audible now?
Yes, yes, Shayanti, yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, I lost connection at my end. I'm so sorry about that.
No problem.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right. All right. So, yeah, so continuing with what I was saying, that the teacher as language and knowledge resource. Now, by language, I do not refer only to the accuracy of language. By language, I also mean how polite is the teacher. You know, there are teachers who could talk down to students without realizing that they are actually doing it. It happens all the time, right? So, whether the teacher is polite, whether she uses motivating language, to encourage her learners, to create a positive kind of environment, to build optimism in her learners. Then the level of clarity which she has. Now, teachers can a teacher can be very proficient with her language, but perhaps she is not very clear. Especially maybe when it comes to giving instructions or when it comes to giving feedback. She might be using circumlocutory language, very long phrases, ambiguous words, and leaving her learners in the dark. So that could also be an impediment in the classroom, right? Then, how sensitive is the teacher's language when she goes about correcting errors, and giving offering constructive criticism to her learners. Then also the whole area of checking concepts. So it's not enough just to deliver a concept or to convey a concept, but also it's also important that the teacher follows it up with the right kind of comprehension check questions, CCQs as they are called. So is the language of checking and understanding how much the learner has retained, how much the learner has understood accurate, right? Then, how well does the teacher consolidate a topic? What is the kind of language she uses to consolidate, to elicit from the learner, to check instructions, to clear doubts? So all of these are different functions of the teacher's classroom language, and she needs to make sure that besides being fluent, besides being accurate, she is able to address all these functions, and she's able to tick all these boxes, of classroom language. So that is another parameter for sure in teacher observation. The next parameter could be planning. Now, what does this mean? Well, planning would mean the pragmatism of the lesson plan, right? How feasible the lesson plan is, how realistically it has been designed, the outcome of the lesson plan, the projection of the lesson plan, the anticipated problems. How well has the teacher been able to anticipate the problems in advance? Is she ready with a solution? Does she have a plan B? Does her lesson plan reflect a backup plan? Right? How innovative, how creative is she in her use of teaching learning resources? And then, of course, her personal growth chart, her personal, there has to be a personal aim too in the lesson plan. Like, for example, a teacher might want to improve her board work. So, does that get reflected in her lesson plan, that she's also paying attention to herself? It's not all about the learner, it's also about the teacher. Or perhaps the teacher has a tell, or maybe she's always very rushed, or maybe she forgets to use ICT, so does the lesson plan have a box which says that, yes, this is my personal aim, and in this session I'd like to pay attention to this as well, besides the learner outcomes and the main aim and the sub aim of my lesson plan? So that would mean the plan. And to what extent is she able to deliver her plan? Because if the planning is flawless, if the planning is meticulous, I would say the implementation is flawless, right? So that goes for planning. And then the next parameter would be the strengths. Now, we have to remember, if you remember when I spoke about what is teacher observation, we have to remember that teacher observation is not only about observing a teacher because, well, we just have to make sure that she's doing the things we need her to do. No, it is also about identifying a teacher's strengths, a teacher's own unique individual strengths, her innovations, the things she brings into the classroom, which maybe another teacher doesn't, because every teacher is unique and every teacher is different, right? So, observation over here, this parameter would also mean that one needs to capitalize on the teacher's strengths, and that has to be done by identifying her strengths, and which can be then shared with her colleagues, setting that teacher as an example, even if it is a best practice, like, say, for example, posting PPTs of online classrooms, conducted on Zoom, maybe, and then posting the PPTs on Google Classroom, or consolidating and reinforcing concepts through a follow up activity, acknowledging the quality, the strength, and presenting it as an example. That is very important if you want to, if teachers need to feel motivated. Now, in this whole COVID 19 situation, my son's school, of course, it shut down, and his classes were being conducted on Zoom. And I had the, I think, invaluable opportunity of observing his teachers. And I realized that every teacher of his has her own unique best practice, and every teacher would do something different. So there was one teacher who, in her presentation during the classroom itself, she had a lot of questions. So she had concept check questions at every stage. And then what she'd do is she'd unmute her students for a bit, and she would allow them to respond to those concept check questions. That would help her to gauge whether her students have understood a particular concept. So this is something which teacher A did. Teacher B had the habit of always posting her presentation on Google Classroom after a Zoom classroom, so that it's on record and the students can refer to it for an assignment. This was teacher B. Teacher C had a practice where she would immediately send a very, very short MCQ type of test on Google Forms, uh, perhaps with just 5 or 7 questions, to check the key concepts which she had delivered during her session, and just to gauge whether the students have understood. So, teacher A, teacher B, teacher C, each of them had a different kind of practice which they brought into the classroom. Now, with teacher observation, what happens is, and when teacher A was not doing what teacher B was doing, and teacher B was not doing what teacher C was doing, that's the interesting part. So, teacher observation will help us pull in all these best practices and figure out some common best practices, and that is what I mean by humanizing your resource. Because we have to understand that the teacher goes beyond the template. There could be so many things, so many tiny, tiny little things which she might be doing every day, and which might be adding a lot of value to her class, and which the students might find enjoyable, beneficial, advantageous, and constructive. Right? So that's the parameter of strengths. So noting down any particular strength or innovation or best practice which the teacher brings into her classroom. Finally, the last parameter, not the last, there could be many, but the last from my side will be the action points. Now, we'll not call them shortcomings because that has a negative ring to it. We'll call them action points. Action points are points where which refer to areas which the teacher needs to work on, right? So these can be brought to the notice of the teacher in a very objective manner. There's nothing personal about it. No one has to take it personally, right? And this can be enabled. This feedback can be enabled through peer observation or self-reflection. Self-reflection is the best possible way to go about this, where the teacher is urged to reflect and state what went well, what could have gone better, making her revisit each stage, recollect mentally, fill up a self-reflection sheet, and maintaining a dossier, so that the observer elicits from the teacher rather than the observer telling the teacher, which obviously brings me to my next point, which is on ways of observing, how to go about observing, right? So these are some of the some tips which I want to share with you. That first of all, when you are setting about teacher observation, do not think of observing, do not go about observing the teacher on all possible parameters, because that's too much of an ask, right? You'll be distracted, the teacher will be under pressure, and nothing will come out of the observation. So a good idea is to have select parameters. So saying that today, okay, today I'm going to observe her only for maybe two areas in classroom management, and one and her use of language and her time management. So not everything, just three or four select things, because I've already shared with you the possible parameters of observation, which is quite exhaustive. So we don't want to encumber or intimidate the teacher by saying, oh, you're going to be observed on 250 parameters, uh, which will be a veritable nightmare for the teacher, right? So first of all, having select parameters for every round of observation. And then while observation, writing maybe a running feedback as the teacher progresses with her lesson. So remember what she's doing at each stage, right? So, yeah. So primarily, where you have running comments, and then you can just say things like, "Oh, she did this beautifully. I thought she elicited this." So it's just like a descriptive kind of observation, a descriptive commentary on the teacher's uh, classroom performance, right? So that it could be that, or it could be a template where the parameters are mentioned, and the teacher, the observer kind of records her observations in the template in the specified columns, right? Now let's look at some templates which we can use. Okay, before that, we have to understand what we need to do after observation. Now, observation is incomplete and not useful in any way if it is not followed by feedback. The teacher needs to know what came out of the observation. So, whether it's self observation or whether it's peer observation. So, feedback can be given in a very democratic manner by first letting the teacher reflect and eliciting from the teacher what went well, what could have gone better, her the things that definitely went very well, the things where she had not anticipated which might not go well. So first of all, getting it out of her. Then maybe if there's a colleague, encouraging the colleague to speak, to make her observations on the teacher. If there are students, then feedback could be collected separately from students, right? And then probably the observer can come in and they can fill in the teacher on their feedback, right? So like I said, it feedback has to be there, and the nature of the feedback has to be in the pies format. So it's this acronym, PIES. So P is for positive, I is for immediate, E is for effective, and S is for structured. So when feedback follows the PIES pattern, it is very, very effective. So what do I mean by, so what does each word mean or imply? So when I say positive, positive is when you start giving your feedback on during teacher observation, always start with the strengths, because that will make the observee more receptive. So always highlight the teacher's strengths first, right? So that's positive feedback. Feedback also needs to be immediate, because since it is a real-time classroom session, the teacher might not remember if you give a delayed feedback, since there's no record of it unless there's a video shooting. So the teacher tends to forget. And therefore, feedback needs to be immediate so that she knows what you're talking about when it's fresh in her mind. Then the third part is it needs to be effective. So even the language of feedback which you use, like you're looking at the teacher's classroom language, the precision of the teacher's classroom language, her accuracy. Similarly, you also have to look at the accuracy of your feedback. It has to be constructive so that the teacher can do something. She can work on that feedback. It has to be a workable feedback. And finally, a structured feedback, which we are going to have a look at. So maybe in the form of a template where there are columns, there are specified parameters given, and the teacher, and it the feedback has a kind of structure. It's not just like one long essay, though even that can be put to good use, but a structured feedback is any day more desirable. right? And then, of course, highlighting the best practices, right? And making a big deal out of the best practices of the teacher, because that will make her more open and receptive to feedback. And that would also motivate her to try and do even better for her next session. Now, these are some sample observation templates for you, which I'm sharing with you. This is actually a template which we use at Cambridge English. In fact, I have to mention over here that Cambridge English um, offers observation. Observation services, teacher observation services to schools who are exam partners who register for Cambridge English exams, right? Who enroll their students for the exam. Now, for more details on this, you obviously have to talk to people in the marketing and the business development departments, but Cambridge English does offer this service of teacher observation. And so, going back to the monitoring report, the teacher observation template, this is a sample observation. You can see this slide has the basic details like who is the observer, then the name of the institution, the name of the teachers who are being monitored, the date of monitoring, and the duration, the actual length of the session. Moving on, this section is overview. It's called overview, but you can see some of the parameters which I discussed earlier. They are mentioned over here, like planning and preparation. So here it says familiarity with the content of the materials provided, well prepared with the materials required. So the teacher is familiar and she is well prepared in under planning and preparation. This can be even more detailed, right? Use of interactive teaching methodology. So what are the interactive tools that the teacher uses? So she opened and closed the session effectively. She achieved the learning outcomes of the activity, rapport with the participants. So presuming the rapport she established was good, then the classroom management instructions, setting up the activities involved to all involvement with all the participants, elicited ideas, responses, etc. Confidence, use English so the teacher as a language resource, if you remember, and then response to questions confidently, questions asked by students. Now, these could be some other parameters, the key strengths of the teacher, key areas for attention. This means the action points, which I spoke about, right? And then these could be comments by the observer and the way forward. So, a path for the teacher, some constructive steps which the teacher needs to take, which the suggestions which need to come from the observer. Now, if you look at this language, this is of course more desirable. This is more like note taking. The language on the left hand side is more like note taking. The language on the right hand side is more structured, more formal. So it says Kavita was familiar and had planned well with the materials. The opening and closing of the session was effectively done. She had good rapport with the students. She managed the class well. Vocabulary was elicited well. Now, this is a detail. This is what I mean by detail. So instead of saying that, she managed well, if we could precisely point out the area that at this stage, though the activity was complicated, though the grouping technique was complicated, though the instructions were complicated, she could stage her instructions. She could group the students within 5 minutes. Things like that need to be mentioned. So, a more detailed kind of description. Then she created opportunities for group work, very positive in giving immediate feedback. Then these are the key strengths. She's very enthusiastic and the class is very interactive. So be generous with your compliments and be very constructive with your criticism, right? So she must work on giving and checking instructions. So probably this teacher may have a problem with the language of instructions. So that can be mentioned. She must work on pronunciation. Now, if you remember, it says that she spoke the language confidently, but perhaps pronunciation is not too standard. So this point has been mentioned. So it is great if even some examples can be mentioned. Like, for example, maybe instead of saying measure, she says measure or something like that. That could make it more precise. With examples. So if it says that she has to work on her sentence structure, Now, what are the sentences? Maybe the exact classroom language, just one or two examples, right? And she could have staged the instructions. So, staging instructions means if you have a longer activity, you have to break the instruction in bits and you give the instruction at each stage so that students don't get muddled and it's not too confusing for them, right? So, if teachers don't do that, then obviously they have to keep repeating themselves. So, this is probably something which Kavita didn't do, and that is why it goes in her action points, right? So, this was to give you an idea about how, about the language of teacher observation, right? Then key areas for yeah, this is a repeat and comments of the review. So the teacher has a very positive attitude and is open to receive feedback, right? So the teacher is receptive. She's receptive to suggestions, to criticism, to compliments, and that is what goes in the observer's remarks. Now, these are some sample observation templates for you, right? So this is where you can have just a smiley, regular face, and a frowning face, and you can document what went well over here under the smiley, or what went okay under the regular face, and what could have gone well under the frowning face, right? So that is, it's a kind of a graphical which goes on the basis of these faces, and it's very clear to the observee what went well and what could have gone better, right? A verbal version of the graphic template would be where you write the stages and you actually write what went well, what could have gone better, and you suggest action points, right? So this could be used as a self reflection and as an evaluation sheet. So it could be used by the teacher and it could also be used by the observer. Right? So the teacher can also do it as a self reflection sheet later or immediately after her session or later when she is watching a recording of her session and she is filling in a template, right? So finally, the takeaways from teacher observation. Well, it acquaints teachers with the strengths of each other. Like I said, if same subject teachers are watching each other, or if it's different subject teachers who are observing each other, definitely they stand to benefit, right? Because they come to know about each other's best practices and innovative techniques and the little things they do in the classroom, which brings value to their teaching, right? Then, if the teacher knows that she is being observed, that someone is taking the pains to sit through her classes, it is going to definitely motivate the teacher and prepare and make her plan and prepare better because she is being treated as a worthwhile human being. A human being who is worthwhile of investing in. So, uh, with that spirit, the teacher also becomes more enthusiastic and she goes that extra mile to prepare herself, right? It puts onus on the observer. Now, observation is not a passive activity. The observer has to be engaged throughout. Just like the teacher, the observer is also equally responsible. Like the teacher is responsible and she's on her toes, she is very alert and she wants to deliver and be at her very best. So does the observer, right? The observer is also engaged at all times. The observer has to en- uh, observe minutely, look for details, and document everything in the template. So it also is about being responsible in the position of an observer, keeping your biases and your prejudices aside and being very fair and objective in your observation, right? And these are, of course, transferable skills. The skills that you acquire observing and being observed are transferable to your classroom, right? Because as an observer, you're not only observing the teacher, you're also observing what the learners are doing, which means that you maybe in your own classroom when you are in action, you're not completely aware all the time of the things that learners are doing. But as a person who is sitting in a corner of the classroom, in an inconspicuous way, you have a better chance of observing learner patterns, learner behavior, interaction patterns, the teacher learner dynamics, and so on and so forth, right? Then it creates a platform for teachers, because if there's this practice of teachers observing each other, it creates a very healthy work environment, and teachers come together on a common platform to share common concerns, to share common best practices, to share their apprehensions and their joys. It's of course an opportunity to celebrate best practices, which I have already spoken about. It ensures continuous growth of both the observer and the teacher, right? And it instills belief and self confidence in the teacher and also in the observer, because even observation is a task which demands a lot of seriousness, a lot of responsibility, and therefore both the teacher and the observer become more responsible, they become more serious, and they are also more motivated, right? So these are some takeaways from teacher observation. And now I am ready to take questions in the form of chats, in the chat box, in the chats that you have typed. If you have any questions, please start with your questions. We can take some questions. Um, and that brings me to the end of my webinar as well. So thank you so much for being so patient. And if you have any further inquiries about Cambridge English exams or about teacher observation services, you can write to these mail IDs. You can drop a mail to these email IDs.
Thank you, Dr. Shayanti. Thank you very much for this. It was quite a very, very good session. So if I could just request the participant just to refrain from thank yous and asking about certificates. If you have any pertinent questions, you can just maybe ask them here. So maybe Shayanti, you can take a few. I think somebody was asking, how often do you suggest to have the teacher's observation so that the teachers do not feel uncomfortable and the real scenario can also be depicted at the same time? So Pradeep has asked that. So would you have an answer?
Right. So actually, it all depends on who is observing, also. If you remember that I spoke about ways of seeing. So if it's the head, and if the head doesn't have too many classes, so observation can happen on a daily basis also, especially during the induction period, or perhaps twice a week or thrice a week. If it's fellow teachers, there could be their timetables could be worked out in such a manner that the teachers get to observe each other at least once a week. Once a week is definitely something I will strongly recommend, right? And then of course it could happen for a period of 2 or 3 months, and then of course it could go down, the frequency could go down. Or it could also if you're getting a special observer like a teacher educator or someone, then of course it depends on the kind of contract which the school enters with the educator, right? So it can be on a daily basis. Obviously all teachers can't be observed on a daily basis, so it could be the observer could come on a daily basis, but she could observe maybe teachers twice a week, right? Or maybe once a week, so that the teacher also gets time to prepare, to plan, and then to reflect on what went well. But I think ideally it should be 2 or 3 times a week if we are looking at taking observation seriously.
I think somebody has asked, how do you, sorry, Shayanti, I think somebody has asked, how
Yeah.
do you manage with mediocre and advanced learners?
Right. So you see, every class will have mixed ability learners, and depending on what your learning outcome is, what is it that you envision to achieve out of that stage in your lesson, you have to group them accordingly. So whenever you group them, just make sure that you delegate particular responsibilities to members of each group. So, for example, if in a group you have strong and weak learners, for a change, maybe if it's a very strong learner, and if the learner is extremely talkative and extroverted, you could probably make that learner the reporter, so that the learner doesn't have anything to do except write down and document. So that will keep that learner in check. and maybe it will, and you can make someone else the team leader, so that a learner who is normally shy or reticent is gets that opportunity to come up and take charge and kind of be a little more responsible. Sometimes you might want to group the strong learners together and the weak learners in a separate group, because you might have different tasks, or you can even grade tasks, for strong and weak learners. So maybe for strong learners the same task but more challenging outcomes. For weak learners, maybe outcomes which are at their level. So that's called grading tasks, grading the task as per the level of the learner. So these are some techniques of handling mixed ability classrooms. I hope that answers your question.
Shayanti, another interesting question. Do you
Mhm.
think the learner is not affected that their teacher is being observed?
uh, do you think that the learner is not affected, that they, no,
Teach-
in fact, if the learner sees that in every class the teacher is in every class the teacher is being observed, and if it's made clear to the learners that these are the reasons why the teacher is being observed, because we want to have a collection of best practices, we want to see how each teacher manages her classroom. And if it's a tradition of the school, there are so many schools where in each class there are two teachers, there's an assisting teacher. So if there's a teacher observer who comes off and on, it shouldn't be out of the place for learners. They can be sensitized to this practice.
Okay, I think I did notice an interesting question, but it just went away. I can't read it. But the gist of
Okay.
the question was, how do you deal with teachers who have a lot of experience? So how do you deal with them when to give them feedback? I think that's a good
Right.
one.
So I think that is why I said self observation. That's a very effective way. In fact, I have been in those shoes, in the observer's shoes, where I have had to observe very senior teachers. And I think I felt that the best thing that worked with them was recording their sessions and having them fill out the templates, because maybe these are the areas which could come under their action points. So you just put in leading phrases. So, for example, if it's a very senior teacher, and she feels that, oh, I don't need, technology in my classroom. So you can just have a column over there saying use of technology. And when the teacher is reflecting on her classroom, obviously she has to put in a blank, or she has to put in some comment, which will make her realize that, yes, maybe I ought to bring myself up to speed with what other teachers are doing. And if there are four teachers teaching the same subject and three of them are using technology and I'm not, then it's better that I bring it into the classroom, because that will just it'll kind of tilt the balance in their favor, and I'll be out of favor. So self reflection, definitely. And then sometimes maybe uh, a colleague, maybe not but with senior teachers, I think even a teacher educator might help, who is from outside the organization. So maybe a colleague may not work, or may not be that effective, because senior teachers, they get into their comfort zone and they think we've been there, done that, and there's no scope for learning more. So it could be a teacher educator from outside, but I will still say self reflection uh, works very well with senior teachers.
Yeah.
But I will still say self-reflection works very well with senior teachers.
I think another interesting question
Mhm.
I think is like, so do you need to give them advance notice for teacher observation, or do you go just like without any prior information? What is more effective?
So it all depends on the school's culture. If the school has a culture of teacher observation, obviously the teachers will know that they will be expecting, these sudden observations once or twice a week. If the school is setting out to start observing teachers, if it's embarking on this practice, on this journey of teacher observation, then I'd say then it's better that you give them a heads up, because after all, you are not trying to catch your teachers unawares. You're not trying to catch them on their wrong foot. So if Teachers are told that they are going to be observed well in advance. It will pep them up, it will help them prepare, motivate them to plan and prepare. And then if they know, okay, this is something which is happening to all teachers, it's not only me under the radar, it's with everyone, they'll be more open to the idea. Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So we'll take one more question, Shayanti.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think somebody has asked, like, in terms of how do you ensure that the teacher knows that we're doing this for their benefit, in terms of to make them motivated. So what would be your recommendation or suggestion?
So I would say that bring on board, bring to table the whole 360-degree implication of observation, which I did mention in one of my slides, right? That teacher observation is not only about assessing or monitoring the teacher or just making sure, okay, she checks in all the boxes, you know. It's not that. It's about celebrating that the teacher's uniqueness. So if you can convey that point, and you have to mean it also. Obviously, it has to come through in your in the objective of teacher observation, where you tell them that we want to see your strengths, we want to see what you bring to the classroom, so that we can share it with everybody. And maybe before that you can have an exercise, like maybe you can have a survey, a student survey or something, where you can ask students what is the thing what's the thing they like best about this particular teacher, and you can use that survey to tell the teacher that this is what students like about you, so we would like a fellow teacher to observe, or we would like to observe your classroom, so that we can we can introduce that best practice in the whole organization or something like that. That should work, that should at least open the door, right? And then of course, once you have the template and once you have these parameters, every teacher is going to realize that it's indispensable for the teacher's growth and her upskilling, right? In fact, it's a very engaged and involved organization that invests in teacher observation. I will certainly say that.
Okay, I think Shayanti, thank you so much for that session. I think it was brilliant. I think, and thanks to the participants for your feedback, because I think looking at the feedback looks like we may have to do another session, because everybody did like it. What I would recommend is that we will send you the presentation, as well as you can go through the whole webinar once again from your home at some time. Let it sink in. Go through the slides. I'm sure you may have made some notes of what Shayanti had said. Let it sink in, so that you get to see what was shared in every slide, and then see how you want to take it forward. I'm sure you'd have to talk to your management, talk to your teacher, see how you want to implement this. But if you need any more details, in terms of, as Shayanti said, that schools that partner with Cambridge and offer these exams as a part of the curriculum, we do help them with teacher observation. So where we send somebody to their school for 3 days, observe the teachers, give them feedback. So if you need more details about that, there's this email IDs which is there on your screen. Please do make a note of it. You could also drop us an email with your school details, saying that we would like to interact with you, or would like to know more details about it, and we'll definitely keep in touch with you. So just to kind of sum up what we were sharing in the beginning, that you will get a certificate, everybody who stayed to the end of the presentation. If you need to email us, the email addresses are over there. If you need to watch the webinar again, feel free to watch it. And if you need more details about the upcoming webinars, which are being done by Cambridge Assessment English, as well as with our office in the UK, so I will give you the link right now on the chat. You can have a look at that. Go ahead, look at our website, take notes in case if you need to attend any webinar in particular, you can register. And we thank you so much to everybody who joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the session. So thank you once again, and thank you, Shayanti. Have a good evening, everybody, and stay safe. So for more details, you can log on to cambridgeenglish.org. Thank you once again. Bye bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.